All right, Friday stand up. Here we go. Let's get right into it. So, this week we've been mostly covering Microsoft's Digital Defense Report 2023. We're going to wrap that up in today's stand up. We've talked, just as a quick review, about 1 through 3 already. 1, multi-factor authentication. 2, is applying zero trust principles. 3 is XDR and extended detection. We're going to talk about 4 and 5 today, which include keeping up to date as well as protecting your data. So let's go ahead and get into starting with keeping up to date. I'm going to tell a story a little bit later on about an experience I had working at a large bank, Fortune 10 size company. But Yuri, let's hear from you. Keeping up to date. What does that mean?
Yeah, Brian. Well, thanks. Software is incredibly complex, and oftentimes vulnerabilities are found in software, right? So for organizations, it's critical to patch all of their systems, all of their applications, all of their users' laptops, servers, etc. Right? This entire digital ecosystem has software that needs to be patched, right? And so staying up to date with those patches is critical because the bad actors, they will exploit vulnerabilities in the software. Thankfully, a lot of software like browsers or, let's say Adobe Reader, they're set to auto update. So you'll often see, a little prompt in your browser saying, hey, click here to relaunch and run the latest patches. So things are improving. That being said, it's still an issue, right? And so when you're thinking about your patch management policy or your vulnerability strategy, you want to make sure that you're thinking about everything in your ecosystem, right? Again, servers, laptops, users, applications, and automation is really key because you've got so many vulnerabilities on your network. You can't just, do them all. And I actually wanted to show a diagram. Let me just share this real quick. We'll go to share screen and then we will. So this is a graphic from Gartner, and I also saw it from SANS, of essentially, a Venn diagram of all known vulnerabilities, right? So in this outer circle, you have all known vulnerabilities. And, in 2023, I think the total count was something along the lines of 192,000, plus known vulnerabilities out in the wild. So this is all the software out there, quite a bit. In this circle, we've got exploited vulnerabilities. So these are vulnerabilities that CISA, a government security agency, you're
talking about the smaller circle, right?
The smaller circle.
The smaller, different blue circle. Yeah.
Right. Exploited vulnerabilities circle. So CISA, the government, cybersecurity and infrastructure agency, they actually they track, vulnerabilities that are exploited in the wild, meaning these are active, vulns that bad actors are exploiting. And so I think at the last count, there was something along the lines of 1,028 known vulnerabilities. So CISA known vulns is about, again, 1,028 total vulnerabilities, right? 192,000 total known vulnerabilities, 1,028, CISA known exploited vulnerabilities. Let me correct that. And then you've got your network, right? So this yellow circle that says your vulnerabilities. So let's say you have, 500 employees and you have hundreds of different applications, hundreds of endpoints, maybe thousands of total devices that include BYOD, phones, mobile devices, etc. So let's just say for all intents and purposes, let's just say you have 20,000 vulns total, right? So when you look at something like this, it might seem like, wow, that's a lot of vulnerabilities. How do I prioritize this? How do I focus on, the critical patching first? And what most experts recommend is focusing on this overlap right here, right, between the exploited vulnerabilities and then the vulnerabilities in your organization that you've detected, right? And what this helps with is, again, is prioritizing those critical vulnerabilities, and helping patch them on time. So we're going to put here, we're going to put vulnerabilities to mitigate, vulns to mitigate. And again, this is kind of from a very high level, right? It's a little bit more complex than this, but from a very high level, if you were to distill it down to its essence, this is one approach to patching your software, making sure that your critical assets are protected, is not by focusing on these 20 vulnerabilities, which frankly, not all might be able to be patched, right? And Brian will talk about that. Um, but by focusing on the vulnerabilities that are between these two circles, right? The vulnerabilities that overlap between your vulnerabilities and the known exploited vulnerabilities. So this, vulnerabilities to mitigate, this might be, let's say, 1,000 vulnerabilities total, right? And so what you're doing is, again, you're prioritizing, and you're not just overwhelmed by the sheer, volume of vulnerability, because you might have one or two people on your team that are doing patch management, or you might have no people at all, right? It's maybe a third party provider. Brian, you have a story you want to talk about that kind of hits this home.
Yeah, so it really brings up a question, and something to just add to the idea of keeping up to date. So I worked at this bank. This was a very large bank. They were Fortune 10. I say were because they're no longer with us, but at the time, significant bank with billions on deposit. And I worked in IT for them, and we had multiple servers that were deemed off limits. For no reason ever do you touch these servers. And these servers were various flavors, various operating systems, various functions that were critical to the operation of the bank. But there were a couple of issues with them. One is oftentimes they were on legacy hardware that could not be replaced. They were on legacy software that could not be replaced. And oftentimes they were implemented by people that were no longer at the bank. So people didn't even really understand how they worked. They just knew that, like, hey, this server right here is allowing ATMs to function across the world. And if you go patch this and it breaks, we can't bring it back online. There's no remediation for that. It would take us days or weeks to fix that. And we can't have ATMs across the globe not working for a week or two. So, and again, we had multiple instances of that for different functions that were critical to the operation of the bank. So what do you do in that type of situation where you, obviously one of the things you want to do is don't let yourself ever get there. Like as you have technology that's reaching end of life, replace it if it's functioning in a way that is supporting critical business operations. Don't let your stuff get to end of life, whether it's hardware or software. But what about if you come into a situation where some of that stuff exists? How do you try and balance keeping up to date with what I'll refer to as the untouchables when it comes to hardware or software?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important conversation you need to have with management, right? Because that also ties into a thing we know as technical debt, right? If you let this technical debt go on for a long, long time, you will have to make payment at some point, and that payment could be a system crash, right? Or it could be, a system that's compromised. But if you have systems like you're mentioning, Brian, one of the things you can do is look at compensating controls. Maybe the ATMs don't need to be on the same network or segment or VLAN where your user traffic is. You want to make sure they're segmented, those devices that are potentially vulnerable or cannot be patched, and that they're not accessible to the entire network. I know hospitals have this problem where they might have an old a pump of some sort, right? And the pump is $100,000 and there are no patches for it, but it's vulnerable. So one thing you can do is you can put, some ACLs or maybe a small firewall in front of some of these devices and totally segment them and get them off of the general VLAN. So again, critical to focus and keep your software up to date. It's not lost on us that you might not be able to update all your software and hardware, but there's some good advice around how do you prioritize it and limit the amount of work that needs to happen.
Makes sense. We're pushing up closer to 15 minutes here. We want to make sure we get to our other topic, protecting data. Let's dive into that a little bit. How do you think about at least just even starting an approach to protecting your data?
Yeah, I mean, so data is really what we're trying to protect in cybersecurity, right? It's the crown jewels of an organization. It's the PII, personally identifiable information, for companies that store some of that type of data. So it's your most valuable digital assets, right? And so you want to make sure you have a good grasp on where your data lives and what are the controls around it, right? You want to make sure you're putting the proper controls. You don't want to have data that's, just to use an analogy, data that's worth $50 that you're putting a $10,000 control over, and vice versa, right? If you have data that is potentially, what I call toxic, meaning that if it's leaked or if it's stolen, there could be a lawsuit on your hands. Maybe the regulators will come knocking on your door. You want to make sure that you're putting proper controls around that data and not making it easily accessible to bad actors. So let's talk about that, Brian. What are some of the critical data that organizations need to protect besides the PII and high value assets that I've kind of called out?
Yeah, I mean, I think just before stepping into that, I think just driving home a point that not all data is created equal. And when I think about approaching how to protect data, the place that I go to start would be to let's classify the data. What different layers or levels of data do we have? One common example of where that's done is with US government data. We've got top secret data, we've got secret data, and then we've got public data as an example. And so the government has used this classification system to classify the sensitivity of data, which then drives different approaches to protecting data based on how it's classified. So in my mind, that's the first place to start with your organization, is identifying what types or what is the data that you have, and then classifying that in some way. And you don't have to use US government as your levels. You could call it level 1, level 2, level 3 data. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that you go through that exercise of saying, here's all the different kinds of data that we have, and here's how we classify the different kinds of data. So as you mentioned, like PII, you might have that as a class 1 or a class 2 data type, where you've got Yuri's Amazon wish list as a class 3 data type. We don't really need to protect that. In fact, we want people to see that so they go buy Yuri's stuff for him, for his birthday or whatever. So starting with understanding what is the data that you have, and then second, going into classifying what are the different layers of protection or different types of protection you want to apply to the various types of data that you might have. And that data, it's really, a lot of it is to be determined by the business. It's not for the cybersecurity professional to say, like, this has to be tier 1 data. Obviously, you can have opinions about certain things that like PII. Like if you've got social security numbers that you're talking about, you can have a very strong opinion about these need to be protected in certain ways. But when it comes to like data about the business, KFC's 11 herbs and spices, that's a tier 1, that's a top secret piece of data. That's for the executives at KFC to say, this is the most secret thing. We need to protect this at all costs.
Right.
But how they do their software procurement process, they might not care about how that works and the data involved in that process, where that comes at a tier 2. So it's, I think, for the cybersecurity professional, make sure you understand the data types, make sure you understand the layers that you need, but then you're going to want to work with the business to really understand how your different data types fall into those categories.
Yeah, absolutely. Good points, Brian. Okay, so that does it for our stand-up for the week. We reviewed the top 5 Microsoft, foundational security hygiene practices to mitigate 99% of attacks. And go take a look at this report again, and we will see you next week. Have a great weekend, Brian.
You too. Take care.
All right.